Welcome to the November 7th, 2023 Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. Today we are joined by a new member of the Finance Subcommittee. Welcome, Sarah. And without further ado, we will cruise through our agenda. So the first item is approval of the October 18th, 2023 subcommittee meeting minutes. Can I get a motion to approve? Thanks, Natalia. Sarah, would you like to second, or you weren't here, so you're not going to second?
I wasn't there.
Okay, I will second. Natalia, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Okay, Sarah, how do you vote?
I'll abstain.
And I will vote yes. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of grants. There are five grants this month. The first one is from the state for SEL and mental health. And this is not the first year of this grant. This has been received before, and this is actually year 3. And specifically, the funds are going to be used. It's $80,000, and they're being used for cartwheel care, which we actually discussed during the youth behavior risk survey, I believe. We talked about cartwheel care and its role in providing emergency mental health services. And it'll also be used for PD for educators and clinicians, and then middle school advisory. The next one is a federal Title I, and that supports schools with higher numbers of children from low-income families. So that is for $674,000, just under $675,000. And it supports instruction and specific additional programming in schools that qualify, which I believe is Lincoln and FRR. Title II for $129,000, $527,000, so just under $130,000. And that is about support for teaching. Title III for $134,884, so just under $135,000. That's for English language learning support. And Title IV, which is increasing academic enrichment, that's for $18,818. So those are the 6 grants that we are 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. Now I miscounted. 5 or 6, whatever it is. 5 grants that we would be voting on today, whether to recommend to support. Any questions from the two of you? No? Okay. I'll make a motion to support, to recommend.
Second.
Okay. Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes.
Natalia?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. And then next up is gifts. And there is one gift this month from the BHS PTO for $765, which is for bus transportation for a drawing class to the Arboretum. So can I get a motion to approve?
Motion to approve the gift.
Thanks. Second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes.
Natalia?
Yes.
And I vote yes. So now we've gotten through that portion of the agenda. Next up is presentation. Oh, go ahead.
The grants, Mariah. I mean, I know we've approved them, but historically, are the figures year on year pretty similar, or is there great fluctuation? I mean, obviously Cartwheel is a new one, but for the other ones?
I don't know. Susan, do you have any sense of like, you probably don't know exactly what they were last year, but do you in general know, do the federal Title I through 4s, are they relatively stable year to year, or do they vary? You're on mute. You're still on mute. Susan, you're on mute.
Well, let's try it this way. a little voice helps, right? Yeah, so those are your entitlement grants. And so generally speaking, there's a formula that they use. And as long as there's no drastic shifts, at the federal level in terms of resource availability, then they are fairly, they might go up a little bit. At times, we've seen some draconian cuts when the economy has been poor, but in general, they're fairly stable amounts.
That's
Slight
actually
increases.
something that it's super helpful to understand too, like some of the grants, if they're multi-year, and I know this one isn't technically a multi-year, it's like given on an each year, but I wonder, Susan, would it be onerous for these grants which are recurring to get on the cover page what the last year amount was, just so that we know, like, is it greatly up or greatly down, so we have a sense of continuity? Okay, that's
Not a
something
problem
that
at all.
Donna could add on. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that would be
happy
really
to.
helpful as we
Yeah.
continue to evolve that cover sheet with useful information.
Mhm.
And okay, that's great. Okay, going on to are we all set with that one? Okay. Next item on the agenda is, it actually has the budget book first and the budget guidelines second, but I want to flip-flop that order. I think if people are okay with that, just because I think that the budget guidelines will be a little bit more of a focused, tight conversation, and the budget book might be less so. So I don't want to accidentally run out of time on the budget book. I don't want to start with the guidelines. I can pull those up. So let me see. You all got this document earlier. And let me see if I can figure out how to make it full screen. I don't know if I can, but I can make it bigger. So there's a couple of changes that I want to talk through from this document to prior years. And we don't have Linus here either. Susan or Betsy, do you know if Linus was coming? I just realized that it's kind of important for this part.
sorry.
I don't believe
know
he
for
is.
sure.
Okay, that's fine. So prior years, at least since I've been on the school committee, this document was authored from the superintendent to the school committee. And I always thought that the structure was a little bit odd because it seems strange to me that the budget guidelines would be from the superintendent, basically recommending to the school committee what the school committee then tells staff what to do. It just felt a little bit convoluted and like sort of way too much back and forth. So this year we flip-flopped it, that it's from the school committee to the superintendent, and the guidelines are really about what we would like to see in the budget proposal. One important thing that also is updated is that essentially the strategic plan, we don't all have it in our hands yet. So we had talked about at the workshop being able to draft these guidelines once the strategic plan next draft comes out with annual metrics or milestones relating to each priority in the strategic plan. However, the timing is such, because of the timing of the strategic plan, where they're still working on that. Essentially, if we wait for the strategic plan to be done, we'll have gone past the budget guidelines cycles usability. And so this basically sidesteps that issue by essentially saying that the leadership team has to ensure alignment. We're not going to have that document for us to do it in advance, but that it's got to all be there in the budget when we see that preliminary budget presented. The other thing in the next paragraph is talking about the multi-year approach, which we switched to a couple of years ago, rather than thinking about each budget as a single, like a one-off, thinking about multi-year. And so, and again, all of this is up for discussion and debate as we move ahead. What, the primary guideline is that everything in the strategic plan or future ones will have clearly identifiable funding in the budget and will be described as part of the work of the relevant units in their budget narrative. So just to give an example, if the ELA review is occurring, which is occurring now, and there's plans to implement it in the FY25 budget, the findings thereof, that we see the actual costs sort of associated with that implementation in the next year, just to pick on one area, but that would be true for everything. And then conversely, there could be activities that are not aligned with the strategic plan. And so how do we identify those, and whether they're immediately defunded, and in some cases that may be possible, but I would imagine in many cases it's not, how we go to a strategy to exit those activities which don't support the strategic plan. And again, the point of that too is, one, if we're doing activities that really don't contribute, they're taking away time from what we could be doing, but also certainly those activities cost money. And as we think about our long-term budget sustainability, how do we focus on the budget and really retain those, focus on just funding the things that really matter to us. And that gives us more funds for those things and allows us to not hopefully have larger issues of sustainability of the budget. And then relating to the strategic plan as well, if we don't have any way to measure the plan, which I believe that those are already being developed, these dashboards or tools, if they're not developed, directing resources so that they're developed in FY25. So again, these are the guidelines, is basically do what the strategic plan is, start to figure out which things don't contribute, make sure that we can measure what's going on. Then on page 2, there's 3 other areas here which have been described. And again, all of this is conversation up for how we want to modify things. The first one was staffing and enrollment. The request would be to address the class sizes at the high school. And there's 2 bits in there. One is ensuring class sizes are closer to recent historical trends, and then broader availability of science classes, which I've heard is an ongoing struggle, the higher level science classes and people not being able to take the AP sciences that they would like to. And then looking at the enrollment forecasts to see how we can do this. And then second area is the BEEP transition, which we talked about last year as part of the discussion, and we just want to make sure that that happens. And some of these things, I don't know for sure, they may actually be in the strategic plan. I'm not 100% sure if, for example, BEEP is, but it may, if they are not, they're here now. And then we've talked about this also is, do we actually hold a staff reserve? This past year we removed it. Should we return to that practice? It's, again, all of these are open questions. That one's particularly a question. Should we be doing that? Equity, we've discussed this as well. What is the educational equity strategy? Is the office undersized? Should it be a distributed strategy, et cetera? But whatever it is, we want that strategy to be funded. This is something that some of us have talked about regarding both in our conversations around summer programming more broadly, but also what's going on with extended school year. Sarah and Natalia, do you both know what extended school year is? So extended school year is, Natalia, for students who are in special education who run a risk of regression during the summer months. And so there's programming for them to shore up their school year experience so that they minimize learning loss. And
Right.
this,
It's a question on that. When are parents informed? Because I feel like
that's another issue.
Is it automatic? Because we, like I know we got informed too late, like we had already made summer plans.
Well, I think you're thinking of, I don't know for sure, but there's extended school year, and then there's some literacy programs that also happen during the summer. And so that's, again, all of that ties into what we're offering. For extended school year, as one example, I think the hours offered last year were, for at least one level, were like 32 hours compared to the state recommendation for 120 hours. So it's very under, it's not happening at the level it should. But also, to your point, this other summer programming, Suzanne and I have discussed, and she was reaching out with Jody to discuss, and Susan and I have discussed a joint meeting to talk about summer programming. And I think we talked about it for December. Is that, I don't have the thing, is that right, Susan? December
I
was
think
when,
so. Yeah.
yeah, I
that's my
think
recollection.
is we're going to have this be a topic for a joint meeting, because it's really important. And so it's hearing about it from the curriculum perspective, and also the issue, and that includes the issues you're talking about, Natalie, is how we actually get students to be able to participate, because of like families need to sign up for camp in January, but if they don't tell you till March, you can't go. And so on and so forth, the other issues around it. So, but having all of that funded in the budget, whatever it is, would be important. And then lastly, for anyone who's been at the policy meetings, we've been talking about policy on life of the school. I think we also talked about this, perhaps some at full school committee as well, but identifying the funding for that policy if it requires funding. And then the third area is basically talking about SIP funding for this upcoming year. As we talked about, we're sort of off cycle. So to the extent there may be SIP activities that need to be funded in FY25 and have been sort of identified, then that would be great to be able to fund those. But then for future fiscal years, again, because this is a multi-year budgetary plan or a budget guidelines document, making sure that the SIP process is part of the budget cycle, as we've discussed here, and making sure that the SIP activities are funded. So this is a starting point from which the subcommittee can discuss what other things we want to recommend and bring to full school committee. I would imagine the process is that we will come up with a list of things that, or however we want this to be written, that we want to bring to the full school committee, and then the full school committee will probably modify it further and before bringing it to a vote. Go ahead, Natalia.
I have some really big picture kind of questions. So budget, from what my understanding, limited understanding, the marginal impact, like since staffing is such a big component, is the decision making around these guidelines, is that for the marginal, or is it also, I guess the equity piece could, you know, like I'm trying to understand how these guidelines get implemented and how do we, for example, fund extended school year, like how do we know that we have the resources to do that? If it's that explicit, could that then mean that we have to reconsider some personnel? You know, I'm trying to understand what the trade-offs are, because I haven't looked at the budgets in that much detail before.
To your point, like this really means that we have to think about, there might be difficult choices here, right? Like there might be trade-offs that are being made. And so, you know, do these things, I think all of these things likely require trade-offs. And I don't know that I have the answer for you yet, and it's a great question. Susan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a couple of actually clarifying questions, and that may be related, but the first one is, are the guidelines as presented here, or as we will be solidifying, related just to next year? Or is this kind of what we would like to see accomplished over the next 4 years? Because the beginning of the document, it says, I think 2025 to 29.
Yeah.
So I just wanted clarity around, are these, you know, kind of the long view priorities,
Yeah.
or are these the short view priorities?
I think that's part of the conversation.
Okay.
And I think that goes to the trade-offs question too. Like some of these
Yeah.
things we could maybe do in 2 years, but we can't do them, but they would be more painful in 1 year, or 3 years versus 1 year. Yes.
Yeah. So that was one question. Another question, since this is my first time through this process here in Brookline, is the expectation that if these are set and these are focused on next year, that we would be costing out the impact of all of these, you know, initiatives, and presenting that baked into our budget, or are you thinking that we have kind of a an educational plan that supports the strategic plan, and these are the items that you'd like us to focus on in a certain order? Or can you just talk a little bit more about how this?
So this is the
drives what you're
first
looking
time
for?
we're
Yeah.
doing this exactly like this.
Okay.
The last year it came from Linus to the committee. It had 4 general goals in it, which one of I think was around staff, one was around equity, one was around academics, and one was around, I think, social emotional learning. So those were the 3 or the 4 areas we had last year. And then we gave examples of things that we were thinking about, or that Linus gave examples of things that he was thinking about, but some of them were very concrete. Like, to give one example, it was like bring steps to success to grade 2, from I think it's grade 3 to grade 2. And then some of them were very broad and vague and almost impossible to quantify or to be, they were things like increased curricular, something very broad about curriculum. I can't give a good example right now. And so some of them I think are almost like those are the day-to-day practice of the school, the district anyway, like increasing curricular, quality would be something that would be happening anyway. And the steps one felt like that was a specific thing that we were changing. So I don't know necessarily that these are exactly the way you want to handle this. And to your point, you might say you bake in, I'm making this up, you make a change to the staff enrollment to address the high school class sizes. At what point do you tell us what are the things that you've had to change to accommodate, if anything, right? Is that like sort of part of it, right? Like where are the decisions made? Where are the trade-offs made? Is that part of the questions too?
Well, and I think too, in my experience, when the board sets priorities, they're the focus areas of the strategic plan that they want us to kind of attend to in the upcoming year. And earlier, as you said, we don't have that strategic plan adopted yet, but we do have a draft of it. And so that's why I'm trying to,
but these are like meant to be the specific things that aren't in the strategic plan, but still are problems that need to be
that's
tweaked,
what I'm
right?
trying
Or
to tease out.
I won't say problems. They're still things that like we
Pain
have all
points.
exactly things that we want to improve. And some of them are very specific and new in ways that the strategic plan future iterations would incorporate possibly, or even this strategic plan may incorporate them because we're still iterating on that. We don't know. And so, but this is school committee's chance to say, hey, these things, like, please make sure that they're in the budget in addition to what the strategic plan ends up being.
Okay. Do you mind if I don't mean to dominate questions, but I do have quite a few.
Yeah.
Can I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I'm, recalling how the budget landed for this year, there was an override, and the override was a multi-year kind of override. And so I guess in my mind, I was kind of imagining that the bottom line was sort of set for the upcoming year. And maybe that's just not, I'm interpreting that inaccurately. I don't know. And so if one, is that true? Is the bottom line set for us? And then it's just how we allocate the resources? Or is it, that's the floor and we can ask for more? Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And Cliff, I would love for you to weigh in as well after I describe it to see if you agree with how I describe it. My general sense of things is that whether it's override or even just our typical long range forecast, under any multi-year budget forecast scenario in the town, all of those numbers are estimates because the town revenue in part derives from resources that we don't necessarily have the ability to forecast perfectly. And so I would say generally we probably know the number, but are we going to get it to the exact 100,000 or 200,000? I don't know. And again, because it's coming from the state and we don't know what they're going to give us, and it's coming from like local taxes and other local revenues, and we don't know what those are going to be because people maybe aren't parking as much or they don't go to a restaurant as much or whatever. So I think that there's wiggle room around the margins. Cliff, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think that was a pretty good summary. Every year there are revenues that we know we're going to get, which are basically property taxes plus 2.5% on that. And otherwise, even for the override, it was built on assumptions that Melissa made, and she's generally conservative. So there's certainly a hope on both sides that revenue will be at least what was projected. But even if it is, I would not expect it to be substantially different than what she projected for the override.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So when the budget is then presented this year, are we expecting, basically sort of a balanced budget?
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's.
In the past couple of years, we have taken the January budget as a preliminary budget request, subject to refinement in the months following.
Okay.
Because for multiple reasons, but one of them is the town doesn't know the actual revenues in January either. And so it gives both sides time to get better numbers, to refine the request, to refine the revenues. And then in May, the committee votes a final number. And over that time, we have come to, each year we've come to this, to a meeting point.
And it's probably worthwhile to just point out for everybody that the revenue allocation is essentially done by a formula through the town school partnership. That formula is, may be revised, but whatever the allocation numbers are, any marginal dollar that comes in, as Mariah was mentioning, will get split along the lines of what the formula is. So I think it's I wouldn't take an approach of thinking that if there's more money that it would all go to one side or the other. It would go through the TSP process.
Okay. Yeah, all this is helpful. So I know how to kind of guide the building of the budget. Can I speak specifically to a question that's here? Return to prior practice of holding reserve funds for a limited number of staff. I'm guessing, like, for example, best practice would be like at the high school. We're budgeting in advance of actually the course selection process and setting the master schedule. So typically what you would do is you would have extra sections, is what I always call them, that you would hold, X number of extra sections that you don't identify by a specific subject, because is it going to the history department? Is it going to the, world language department? Depends on kind of what the signups are for kids. So best practice is always to hold a certain number of sections to address any kinds of shifts in enrollment or interest when you're scheduling. So if I was going to weigh in, I would say, that is very prudent to do. You don't want to have too many, right? Over time, you kind of get a sense of it, of how many sections you should hold, but it does allow you to then manage class size in a way without this early in the process trying to clarify exactly how many FTE in every single subject area is required. So,
in prior years, I think there was 400 or 425,000 held, not just for the high school, but for the K-8s as well. Mm-hmm. So if you needed an extra teacher, whatever, the 5th grade at whatever school has grown unexpectedly, you could add in another section. My only, it's a question in my mind too, because we didn't do this. We did it until 2 years ago, then we didn't do it last year, and we don't necessarily have the funding for it. So are we pulling, just if we're talking about 400,000? Are we pulling, X number of people out of existing positions to hold? I guess I don't quite know what this looks like, and that's more a puzzle for you all to figure out if this makes sense. And I think this, all of these are conversations with staff and with the committee of, are we more conservative in one spot to hold these? But it would require not filling positions to hold the funds, I think, at this point. Like it would require not filling positions for FY25 to be able to hold the funds in reserve. So.
Right. Yeah. So you might want to consider a strategy of like refunding, this over the next couple of years. And so,
right. We might go
build
from
in incremental amounts in order
Makes
to
a lot
get
of
to what
sense.
the, sweet spot is for not asking for money you're really not going to need, because that also involves, making adjustments in other areas, as you said, that you may not want to make that, that choice. So it could be, that we just start to, move ourselves towards that.
I was gonna
Natalia,
ask,
did you have a question?
Yeah, just how flexible are categories? Like, does it have to be staff? Like having a reserve fund makes a lot of sense, but if we have to return the money because we don't need to use it, but is it very clear, like staffing, like teaching? Like I don't understand enough about the budget process to know like how fungible across categories money is,
Susan?
if at all.
I'm not, in my experience, I've never really needed to have any reserve funds for non-salary. You can usually budget pretty tight on that. Once you get, familiar with your spending profile, right? Which I'm not yet. I can't advise in that way. We'll be able to as time goes on. But in general, supply money, I'll give that as an example, right? Generally speaking, there's a certain amount of supply money you would spend. Oftentimes, schools will allocate based on a per pupil basis and give us a certain amount of money to each school. Where I do see you have variation really is in utilities, which I don't believe come out of our budget. I think that comes out of a town budget. Special education, you often see volatility in the numbers there, because you can't always anticipate what students are going to need for different services. They may shift during the year. You might have students that come to you later in the process, and so therefore you don't have the funding for it. So I have seen volatility there, but you can set up, and I'm not sure, Mariah, you would know off the top of your head, I'd have to look it up. Do we have a special education revolving fund to handle volatility like that?
We have the circuit breaker, but we don't have one that's a special education specific revolving fund. Like it's not called special education revolving fund.
Yeah, so there is the law does permit us to set aside in a revolving fund reserve money for that. So I've handled it in that way. And so if we get into a situation, that way we're not building in every year. It's kind of like circuit breaker. You have a relief valve, so that if you get yourself into a situation with real unanticipated cost increases in that area, you have a way to be able to moderate the impact of that on your budget. So it might be a strategy down the line to have a conversation about. But yeah, staffing is the one area, especially at the high school, that I've found that it's prudent really to allow a certain number of sections to be set aside. They're always used. I never had a year that we didn't use the sections, but I knew our high school and middle school really well because I worked there 17 years. So we had that kind of really refined. So, I don't know that you need to have a lot of, we'll say, relief valves built in, but certainly.
I guess my question, Susan, was if you've reserved it for staffing and at the very end we realize we've reserved too much, could that be used for other costs? For example, could we use it to do an equity audit or something like, or do we have to return that money? That was my question more.
Okay, I'm sorry.
If we get it wrong on the staffing side and we've held too much, does that get returned, or can we reallocated?
So this is actually part of the finance policy that we haven't updated or been following, which is about the transfer of funds across categories and at what point school committee needs to approve them and at what point it's just a staff decision to reallocate. And we actually have a policy which we don't follow. And so at least for recent years, staff have been reallocating funds across categories as needed.
And yeah, so usually, like Mariah said, there's like a balance there. During the year, you know, moderate shifts between accounts. I always say non-salary accounts. I never allow staff to make shifts between salary accounts and non-salary accounts. But you know, you budget for textbooks, let's say, and you budgeted at $75 per book. And then when you actually go to buy them, they're $80. You know, you still need the same number of books, but you're going to be a little short in that line. But in another line, you know, something come in a little less to allow, you know, the flexibility on smaller amounts to be able to transfer the money to cover that is pretty standard practice. But what it comes down to really is like what was appropriated. You know, your spending plan, when the school committee approves a budget, it's approving an appropriation. The appropriation is for specific things. So I would argue that if we didn't fund something in the budget, like if you're reallocating for something that was appropriated in the budget, that's one thing. If you're going to ask for something that's like come up in mid-year, right, kind of course correction stuff, that you have to go through a process of the school committee definitely approving that. So I'm not sure what the policy reads like, but usually when you get into your third quarter, I do what would be called a cost to complete. This year is going to be tough because I didn't create the budget, so it'll be harder for me to be able to do that this year. Next year, when we get to the third quarter, I should be able to, as we get closer to the year, you know, I usually pause any spending and I do a forecast of where I think we're going to land. If we're going to have some capacity at that point, then we have a conversation about what we may fund with that. And that's a public conversation. It's usually, you know, it's usually brought forward a recommendation from the administration and a conversation with the board. So just as some, you know, to maybe, you know, offer that as you know, kind of a way that we would, you know, conduct our you know, when and if and how money gets transferred. I would just say that there's certain times during the year where different you know, kind of rules may apply, and certainly dollar values would be also a part of that. Does that make sense?
Natalie, are you good with that answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
I think that the thing I'm going to take away from this conversation, this portion of the conversation, is how do we perhaps do this reserve fund planning and or special education reserve fund as a multi-year budget item also, rather than it going in staffing and enrollment, but pushing it down there, but making it multi-year. That allows you to be more incremental as you, Susan, become more comfortable with the budget, as you start to feel out what the needs are. It doesn't really ask us to take a hard turn this next year by yanking anything out. So Sarah, go ahead.
All of this is, yeah, okay. All of this is super helpful. So Susan, I really enjoyed hearing you speak about that. But as we keep on working with you, I just kind of have another couple of questions exactly about what you're talking about. So you were saying that in your prior positions, you knew the school so well that you could anticipate the budget. And I'm just trying to understand the thinking behind that. So like, if your budget stays the same year to year with, you know, cost of living increases like changing, but at different times in Brookline, we're going to have larger classes go through and smaller classes go through. And so do you kind of have, when you say you just have a feel for what changes you need to make, is that what you look at in order to get the feel, is the numbers? So like, okay, we're going to need an additional half-time guidance counselor because we have this many more kids this year. Is that how you go about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my preference is that we do zero-based budgeting, which is not really what's being done here at this point. There's maybe more a service level service budgeting with, enhancements.
We
That's what I
have
see.
tried it in the past. I
Yeah.
agree with you.
Oh.
We're not doing it. I can't wait for us to do it.
Yeah. And so what happens is that we look at, what are our needs in this particular year, which is what I call the educational plan. So we have a certain number of students, and those students, in general, we have a pretty good sense of, what those needs are for those kids, and also the areas in which we're trying to grow, right? We're trying to improve. And so as we build the budget, we're building the budget around school improvement and providing a quality educational experience for kids. So once we get ourselves on cycle, as Mariah said, we'll first of all be able to demonstrate, and reflect every year and say, hey, we made the mark here, or no, we went down this, went on a journey over here, and we found out that, we need to course correct. And so all of that is a lot of conversation that takes place. And when you understand your programs and your student population, then it's easy to understand the relationship between, if we make this pivot and go in this direction, then we're kind of shedding this kind of expense over here in order to invest over there, right? But it takes I'm just walking in, so I don't know your programs yet well enough to be able to, and we don't have the strategic plan identified. But once we get some of these, and and into this kind of routine and cycle of, here's our educational plan, we self-reflect, we course correct, we modify the spending plan in order to realign our resources to be able to deliver on that educational plan. So that's kind of what the flow is. Am I answering the question? Is
Yes, because my question is so general. It's just, how do you go about thinking about this? So,
yeah.
For like what you're talking about right now, one thing that would be helpful to know is, what are your milestones along the process? When do you expect for us to talk about this again? And does that align with when we're meeting again, right? So, anything that's kind of just sort of natural for you is, I would like to hear the details of it so that we can anticipate what we need to do.
Yeah. You want me to keep going, Mariah?
Let me take one little bit at this and then have you fill it in.
Yep.
Which is, just if we work backwards, Sarah, the budget book is to be presented to the school committee in early/mid-January. I think the date is the 8th, 12th. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's pretty early in January. And so much needs to happen in the next 2 months in terms of budgeting, that where Susan and her team and all of the budget managers are going to be very focused on that. And I think that in terms of our guidance, the earlier we can deliver a document that really helps them understand what we're expecting, the better. And so my hope is, and then Susan, I'll turn it over to you in a minute. My hope is that today, the three of us can take this first crack at, the big questions are, does this structure work? Do we like the things? Do we agree that the first page really is, you have to focus on the strategic plan and these two corollaries to that about cutting stuff out and making sure you can measure it? And then, are these the 8 things in 3 categories we want to present? Are there additional things that we know the committee has focused on that we want to make sure make it in? Are there things here we want to remove? And how do we proceed on that? So I'm hoping that we as a committee can have that discussion maybe after Susan adds to this in sort of timing, because I want to make sure that we're supposed to bring the first draft of this to the full school committee next week. Doesn't mean that we've necessarily voted to recommend it yet, but it certainly means that we should be presenting something for discussion next week. Susan, go ahead on
That's really
timeline.
good, because we're going to have to communicate that very quickly to Susan. So that's excellent that we would be talking about our priorities.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm going to go with what the cycle looks like typically. So generally speaking, once the strategic plan is adopted, then the schools need to align their school improvement plans to that. And there's 2 parts to it. There's the overall strategic plan of the district, or the district, improvement plan. And then each school has their own issues that they're trying to address, as well as attend to the broader district plan. So there needs to be a realignment of that. And so once this is adopted, the strategic plan, then the school improvement plans should be, kind of reviewed in light of that. So in my experience, if the school improvement plans are adopted at the end of the school year, then the school committee in the summertime reviews where we are. We do our reflection, usually at a retreat, and we look at what progress did we make over the summer, or over the last year. Where did we land? And now let's set the priorities for the upcoming year so that when we start the budget development process, these are already identified. Then when I send out the big message that it's time to build the upcoming budget, what I do is I say, here's the strategic plan, you have your school improvement plans, and here's the school committee's priorities for the year. And then we build out of that. Okay, we build a zero-based budget with that in mind. Right now, we're kind of out of cycle. So I've already had to push out to staff, the budget gathering templates. Because if I'm going to give you a document in January, then I have to be actively working on it right now. So what we'll have to do this year, and this is why I'm asking a lot of these questions, because I want to make sure that that we're able to provide you with what you're looking for. I don't want a situation where there just isn't enough time or capacity to be able to deliver a budget to you that meets all of your needs. And so then what does that look like? So normally that's the way it would be, so that when we're giving you your budget, it's administrative proposal typically, and we go through it and we explain in our narratives, we give you information on enrollment, we give you information on staffing, and then we explain to you, how the funding is tied to our educational plan. And then there's dialogue. Usually there's a process called deliberation, which is when the school committee asks a lot of questions, and we might make some adjustments here and there in order to land on an adopted budget. So that's typically the cycle. Is that helpful? I mean, and I think that's the direction we're trying to move in, so that when we're developing the budget, that we have the school improvement plan that has been adopted, that the school committee is looking at that improvement plan and the strategic plan and setting these types of priorities for the upcoming development. So we're a little behind the 8 ball.
Can I ask a question on that,
Yeah.
behind the 8 ball? Well, my question is a two-parter. I'm going to ask both of them at the same time so you can hear them both. So given that we're talking about these things, but you've already given people, essentially, you've asked them to do a budget in the absence of this information. I mean, some of it's not completely absent because I'm sure that they've been percolating on some of these issues too, but
Exactly.
which of these things do you think are feasible for FY25, and which of them you're like, there's just no way we can do that? And then I would say my part B of that is, in your experience, when you had already gone through the summer sort of timeline and had done these things with people, and then things came out of left field that weren't anticipated for whatever reason, how did you adapt your budget when you'd already started developing it and then things showed up?
Right. Well, there's a whole lot in that. There's a whole lot. Do we have 2 hours? No. So let's see, where do I begin with that? So as you're developing the budget, I think it's more internally what happens on the administrative side is there's a conversation. This is conversation, right? We're building the budget and we're having conversation about what does this mean? Does it include all of we look through different, to the request through different lenses. And so that we make sure that we're able to provide a balanced quality educational plan in the budget. There's usually, there's always competition, right? Because we're government. And so what that means is that I always say that you can get everything done in education. You just can't get it done always in the time, space, and sequence you want to. But if you're clear about what your goals are, and and there are choices that are made along the way. They're just timing choices as opposed to saying no, never. So if something comes up in the process, like we're seeing, and you have your priorities, right? But since you adopt this in the summertime, we're seeing as we open the school year, and you get into your school year, hey, Houston, we got some problems here we need to attend to. We would include that because this is our budget, right? This is
Right.
collectively our budget. And so we're going to provide that kind of leadership to you as we go along. There could be conversations along the way about, hey, midpoint conversations. So usually, again, once we can get ourselves, I'll say just set up for success, right? Once we can get on cycle with everything. What I would normally do, after I do enrollment forecasts, which we've got a whole lot of work to do on enrollment forecasts. So that's not, we have to do that work in order to be able to use that in a meaningful way. That will happen this year. We'll incorporate that more meaningfully next year. But I would be giving this out, and then I would start doing what I call a thumbnail to the board that would kind of signal, here's some basic, a basic idea of what our breathing expenses will cost us next year, right? And so I can look and say, hey, we've got X number of, we have some enrollment increases we're going to have to deal with. Let's just back of the napkin say we're going to have to add a couple of teachers. Let's say, we know right now, I've just signed a 5-year contract. I'm just making this up right now. 5-year contract for utilities. I know that the first year of the contract, I'm going to have to increase utilities by 5% because of market, right? So I take and I give you a thumbnail estimate, and then I whittle that, right? I whittle that. And so you get some information along the way so that you kind of have a sense of where we're at. The first one is going to be, I call it kind of a cartoon. It's like really high level categories. Once I get familiar with, again, profile of spending, I can tell you, like, the average cost of step and column is this. We know that the teacher's contract settled for this, so I'm going to give you some numbers and say, therefore, your step and column is about $500,000 every year, and your cost of living is, let's say, 3%. So you're going to take your salary line, and I'm going to give you a thumbnail increase of an 8% increase. So over time, I'll be able to provide you with that level of information as we go along. And then we can, have some conversations oftentimes about, whoa, you can't go up 20%. That is not tolerable. So, we need to start to winnow down. So there's conversation along the way that we can't, we're not in a position to really, we're not really there yet.
Susan, I'll say 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B for sure have been, and maybe I'll say 1C have all been discussed already, and 3A and 3B. Like, none of these things are coming out of left field.
No,
so,
I would think, A and B are in the works, right? So that will be part of our proposal.
You're saying 1A and 1B.
1A and 1B.
Yeah.
When I look at like 2A, 2B, I start getting, I'm not sure exactly what that means, because I don't know that until we get the strategic plan created and approved, what is that going to, like, I don't know how we would, what that means for the budget, to be honest with you. 2A. 2B, when I look at that, that's a lot, right? That could be a lot of money. And to really do an in-depth analysis and time to get that to you for the budget.
Well, last year, extended school year was funded out of a state funding. It wasn't funded out of the budget. So.
Yeah. So first of all, we have to say, what do we mean when we say extended school year funding, right? And so first you got to define that before we can then put together costs. So that's why I'm saying that feels like a much bigger conversation that would need to be had before we could actually try to move forward with putting numbers to that. So that's, I'm just giving you my honest feedback on that. Okay. Should policy on
2A and 2B might be, again, as we talk about multi-year strategies, because I think that the conversation I've heard is that Dr. Galloway is not ready for to have the educational equity strategy presented yet. She's still in fact-finding mode. So that might be it's a 2-year, and the next one is a 2-year as well.
Absolutely,
2-year plus. Okay.
absolutely. And that would, again, that would flow out of our strategic plan, right? So when
Yep.
we look at the governance section of the strategic plan, we can't change every office. So we call kind of naming wise, we have 4 offices: Office of Educational Equity, Office of Administration and Finance, Office of Teaching and Learning, and Office of Student Services. So there's 4 offices. We can't possibly completely restructure 4 offices at the same time, right?
Mhm.
So what you'll see when I write that particular section of the strategic plan, you know, it will be measurable. So which office are we looking at first, and then what office, and then what office, you know, because yeah. So I think you're right. If you move A down, if you even B seems like a strategy, almost an equity strategy, as you said here, but that could play out in a variety of different ways. And what do you do in what year? Because you want to build the programming. You don't want to, you want to build the programming incrementally. So that's what I say. A and B, I would think belong down in the multi-year section.
Well, it's all going to be multi-year, I think. I think we need to
Okay.
put a label on A and 2A and 2B that these are perhaps for FY26 and beyond.
There you go. There you go.
Committee members, I'm going to bring us back to specific questions. The first one is there anything you want to add or delete? And then the second one is, do you feel comfortable with the strategy of 1A, 1B being labeled for, and 3A being labeled for FY25, and 1C being a multi-year strategy starting in FY25, but it's going to take time to sort of build up this reserve fund. And then 2A, 2B, 2C being explicitly as a multi-year thing to address, issues to address.
Before Natalia speaks, I just am going to explain why I'm holding back from this. So this conversation, I really want what we do to not be something that we like turn quickly and make changes. So I'm staying out of the conversation only because I just joined the school committee last week.
Yeah.
And so if you ask me, is this what I've heard people talking about? It is, because we did talk about, I guess I was also present for when you talked about the strategic plan, but I can't do a great job of representing what the group of us has wanted over time, and the two of you can. So that's the only reason why I'm being quiet as you and Natalia work it out.
Sure. And just to remind you, before I go to you, Natalia, just to remind you, Sarah, again, this is basically, do we want this structure to go to the committee for their adoption and discussion, as opposed to us proclaiming something unilaterally? Natalia, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that point, Mariah, that it sounds good. And I do think a broader committee discussion is important also, because I'm relatively new, but I like this idea of some of these being multi-year. In terms of what might be missing, I mean, I guess class size, we focus on high school because we have policy on K-8 class size, right? So that's where in the high school we don't have policy.
K-8 is essentially the class sizes. We saw the data at our last finance
has been
meeting.
good. No, but sort of saying that the guideline is to continue, like to continue in that, like since these guidelines, I mean, I would like to acknowledge, that K-8, that we still believe in those guidelines, like just because it didn't happen.
This is above
this
and
year.
beyond this is above and beyond the things in the, yes, right.
Both policy. So, I mean, I think the equity one is the one where I'm a little unclear, because the guideline, the way it's drafted, it seems kind of like whatever you decide, make sure you fund it. But I think we want to be part of the decision making, and that's where, on the strategic plan, we are part of it. So I would like to. I don't know how to frame it in a way that the guideline of, yes, we should fund it, but we should be part of that discussion on what exactly we've decided. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I think that that's almost a separate conversation, though, of like, the issue is a lot of times we talk about what to do and then we don't actually have money for it. So I think we need to like make
Put
sure that
forward.
right, exactly, like, oh, and so I think having it here, but I agree with you that there's going to be lots of other conversations. It's not just a unilateral, like, we don't want to know about it, we only want to fund it. there's going to be lots
Yeah,
of other
okay.
conversations going on there.
And to
Okay.
your point about defunding, I mean, I think that is, you know, obviously it's logical, but it does raise some concerns. Like, I'd like to know what we are defunding. That would be my only additional.
Sure. Yep. Val?
Yeah, hi. I had a question on 2B and 2C. When you call it multi-year, I guess I just get concerned about making sure that we're at a minimum covering our legal obligations. And I'm not always sure that we are under 2B
Yeah.
and 2C.
Yes.
Susan, can you speak to that at all? Or Mariah? Yeah.
I can speak to 2B for extended school year for last year because I specifically asked, and the answer was, well, the state is recommending it and not mandating the number of hours offered. But I agree with you that that's an important thing for us to possibly for us to discuss. And that trade-off, and I think this will come up at policy and then at the next meeting in December on extended school year. Anyways, I agree with you that that's a great point of, should we actually be deferring them, or is it really an obligation to do that in the next year? Susan, what do you think about those two?
Yeah, I think that certainly we have an obligation to fund some of this, right? I mean, extended year programs, as you said earlier, is to provide, you know, typically students with special needs, the opportunity to continue through the summer months so that there's no learning loss that occurs. I'm not really clear yet what other summer programming we have, because I'm just too new to know that. What I would say is that when we have our meeting, the joint meeting in December, and we, kind of tease out what we mean by these, we can certainly make sure that any extended school year programming that we need to be providing for kids is, front and center. And then anything that may be more for, learning enhancement, and or, meeting the needs of other populations that may be struggling, that we can do, our best if we can identify those to be able to include something for them. But I think there's a bigger conversation here around that before we could really be able to say this is what this is, and this is where the funding's coming from.
Well, maybe this one too should be broken into a two-parter, where the ESY issue is really brought forwards for the fiscal year, and the broader conversation of the other summer programming, which is not a mandate, is brought as a multi-year strategy.
Yeah, because other summer programming can be enrichment, it can be credit recovery, it can be, all these other things.
Well, also, I mean, I will say that when I wrote that one, what part of what I was thinking about, which I think we talked about somewhere, was at one of these meetings, was this idea of how do we, I think it was at the workshop, how do we, for example, for students who are on IEPs who use Learning Center at the high school, how do we allow them to, for example, take electives that they can't take during the year due to their Learning Center participation in the summer instead, so that they still get those experiences? But that's, and there's other things, but that is different than extended school year. I think there's a difference there, a meaningful difference.
There is, and I think on some of that you'd have to pilot it, right? I think of the first summer of COVID, when we were trying to add programming in the summertime in my school district, there was, teachers were pretty burnt out by the end of the first, and then getting people to actually run the courses was really challenging. So I think we can build the program, but we also have to staff it. And do we have people that, the bigger the program, the harder it's going to be to staff. So again, what are the priorities? What do we mean? And what focus areas do we want to, attend to, first?
Yeah.
See how
Val,
that
is
goes.
Sorry, Val,
And
is
then-
that an old hand or a new hand? Old hand. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I have enough to modify this to following everyone's guidance from this meeting and bring it on Monday to the full school committee. Full disclosure, I'm flying to Portugal that night, so I think we're on the agenda for like 6:10 on Monday. and my flight's at 9:15, so hopefully I can take the call real quick for 10 minutes from home before we go to the airport. But that's, if I can't, then you all have to fill in.
Yeah.
Susan, you had your hand up, I saw.
Just one other thought, because it's really huge, and that's the capital piece.
Yeah,
And I just think adding maybe a bullet number 4, or an item number 4 that's capital, would be really important, because it's an awful lot of work. You know, it affects us across the organization, you know.
I was wondering about that and wondering, should it be rather than alluded to as a special thing, because you do already basically know about it. We already have the CIP and the building projects aligned. So, or alternatively, should the capital planning be in the strategic plan so that it's already woven into, because it's, you know about it, it's a huge part of your activities. So really, should that already be in the strategic plan and not called out here?
Well, and I guess it depends on how you would like to handle this moving forward. But when you're looking at things that cross multiple years that we need to keep our eye on and focus our attention and organizational energy on, the Pierce project, being able to, you know, prepare for that. In the budget, we're going to have, and it's not in the operating budget, but certainly as part of the Pierce planning for the Pierce, we have to have transportation. You know, we're going to have, you know, spaces modified. Now there's money that's set aside in the Pierce building project, but there's an awful lot of planning that doesn't get accounted for. And I just think that incorporating it at, you know, in your guidelines is helpful, because it signals to people that this is something we value and it is an integral part.
But see, I think of
what we're
these
doing.
guidelines as sort of like things that didn't make it into the strategic plan. And maybe they would in a future year, but they haven't for whatever reason in the current draft of the strategic plan. That's what I'm thinking about these things. And in my mind, there's no reason for the capital planning stuff at the level that we're sort of talking about, the high sort of strategic level, not to be in the strategic plan. Right?
Then maybe when there's the conversation at the school committee level about the strategic plan, then maybe we should include where we might incorporate the capital component into that.
Okay.
You know, just so
Yeah.
it's someplace,
Or
right?
or maybe we go back to, we had that conversation, you and Jody and Linus and I with David, and say, where, like, look, this came up, and is it going to be rolled into the strategic plan, or should we be calling it out here that there's
Right.
capital activities and see what they
And
want?
then
Okay.
we'll know, you know, this is how
Okay.
we're going to handle that.
Natalia, is that an old hand or a new hand?
It's a new hand, just to let you know, I'm not at school committee on Monday, so we're going to
Okay.
be leaving Sarah to report. Sorry, Sarah.
You know, I'm so sorry. I have a flight that evening too.
Oh, we should check with Betsy if there's going to be quorum, because I have a, yeah.
Betsy,
told-
we're 3 down.
I told
We are,
Betsy too.
that'll give us 6, so
Just-
it's a little tight, but we
Okay,
are,
so it's just the 3 of us? Okay.
that's right.
Okay, well then I'll stay on the phone as we go in the Uber and through the tunnel and whatever. Cliff, go ahead, and then I want to switch to the budget book conversation.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, to Susan's last point regarding capital, you know, it's unfortunate that Carol's not here because she might have some comments about this. But I guess the only thing I would say is that to the extent that what happens with capital projects or management of capital assets impacts the operating budget. In the last couple of years, you know, we've had some cost overruns related to, you know, operations. There's the ongoing issue with deferred maintenance, you know, blah, blah, blah. I just would encourage the school committee to find a way for that information to be more broadly disseminated among the group, so that people were more aware. Because the past, you know, I think Mariah, you're on top of everything, and you know, Helen certainly is. But I've always gotten the sense that maybe some of your compatriots aren't quite as up to speed on the issues, and I could be wrong, but that may be because they're not, there's sort of a separation between capital and operating, when in fact there's a certain amount of overlap that really should be understood better. So,
does that, is there a logical conclusion that one would draw from that? Just bringing it back to this document and where these issues should be. Should they be in the strategic plan? Should they be called out? Like,
well, look, I think it's hard for me to comment whether it belongs in a strategic plan, because I don't know what that's going to look like or how you would incorporate it. I think
Right.
from a strategic plan in capital, I could foresee, a requirement, a strategy to develop what we haven't had is actually a capital, long-term capital plan that is more formally designed than what we've had before, and some of our peer communities. But that to me is a little bit different than what we're talking about here, at least as I heard Susan. I think what I heard was more of a not day-to-day, but the annual operating of your capital assets impacts, the operating budget, and it does. And to the extent that people aren't quite as aware of it, I think it's maybe a responsibility of this group to understand some of that stuff better, and then to be able to bring it in a way that educates your compatriots to the level that you certainly personally understand it. And I just don't think that's happened before.
okay,
So that's my 2 cents.
we'll figure this bit out. I'm going to switch topics now. Thank you all for this. I'm going to switch topics to, if I can figure out how to move this thing, the budget book outline. You don't actually have a copy of this. Susan and I were just working through some of the details here earlier, but you saw a version of this, the members of the committee who were here last year, which is I think just me. So I saw a version of this last year. And it's what we used to, just to give a little bit of history. 2 years ago, we had, I'll say prior to 2 years ago, 3 years ago back, we had a couple of years where we didn't really get a budget book. We got some stuff on OpenGov, but it didn't really have a strong narrative to it. And with Linus coming in, he immediately saw that there was a problem with that and needed to be addressed. And so 2 years ago, we had our first true budget book again, which was very valuable. And it was a 1.0. There was a lot of great things in it and some areas where we could, some opportunities to change things. Last year, we went through and we thought, let's develop a sort of shared understanding of what this is going to look like. And this is the first draft of the revised version. And so I'm going to just walk through it quickly. It's mostly the same as last year's budget book, which mostly delivered on this format, but I want to highlight a couple of changes just to forecast them to you. And then if you see things that you also would like to change, we can talk about those too. The first thing is the timing of the timing that this budget book is going to cover, without getting into the details yet, the timing that this is going to cover. Susan and I were talking earlier about best practices for budgeting and what should the budget include. And the best practice is 3 years of actuals. So that would be FY 23, 22, and 21. And then the current year, so FY 24, and then the requested year. So that would be FY 25. Because of the changes in the accounting structure, doing some of that historical data is really complicated because things have been moved around and it's not really reconcilable year to year prior to FY 23, which was last year. And so for this budget, the plan is that for when we're doing these multi-year, showing the multi-year requests, we're going to have FY23, which is last year actuals, FY24, which is the current year, and then FY25, which is the request. And then for future years, as we get these actuals lined up in the current accounting system, then we'll start to have 3 years backwards. But for the current time, we'll have 3 years for this next budget. Another big change from last year is that while we had set up a system where there would be budgets by schools, a lot of the staff and the resources were still included under both Office of Student Services. So for example, all of the special educators, all of the psychologists, the guidance counselors, none of them were actually allocated into the school budgets. They were in a centralized budget. Same thing for many of the teachers. The K-5 teachers were in the schools, but for example, the 6-8 ELA, math, science were actually all listed under teaching and learning. So again, this year, Susan, the goal is to actually show the schools fully, the staff fully allocated into the schools. And this is actually the state guidance is to state law, I think, actually, not just guidance, but law, right, Susan, is to present the budget in that way. And I think it also, it's not only the law, but it shows what we want to make clear, which is where the people who are here are doing the work, which is they're student facing and they're student centered. They're not in a central department. And then even, you know, there's almost 75 custodians, and those also will be allocated into the building. So really showing where people are and really having that be represented in the building. So that's a second big change that I want to highlight here. Third big change is having an executive summary section that would have some of the key things that you need to know as you go into looking at the rest of the budget. So it would include the strategic plan, which may be final at this point, may still be in near final draft form, but we'll have that. It would have the budget guidelines, the version that the school committee adopts when we do that. It will have the budget calendar that we adopted last week, and it will have student enrollment information. So all of those are really critical to understanding the budget that you're going to see. And then the fourth and final big thing that I think is a big difference from last year is there was some limited special revenue fund information, and I think Susan is going to build on what was there last year. So that's the revolving funds and some of the larger, more impactful funds that we have, possibly some of the grant funds, but it will discuss those. So that's what we're at right now for the budget book outline. So again, it will have an executive summary, big overarching operating budget for the entire district. It'll have some facts and some information about that. The budgets by schools, which again will be where things will be shifting to significantly, which is a really great important change this year, really showing where our efforts are. Budgets by the district departments, so that'll be school committee and superintendent, teaching and learning, student services, education equity, and administration and finance. You can see some of the sub areas within some of them, but the 5 that are there are the big 5. The CIP, which we've already voted earlier this year, we voted this year's request and then the forecast, and then you'll see some of the project summaries, the special revenue funds I mentioned, and then some of the background district information that we've provided in prior years. So the school district map, school committee, school information, student demographics, and so forth. So I know that was a super quick overview, and I wanted to know if finance subcommittee members had any thoughts on any of this. We can circulate this document afterwards as well. But we're trying to balance the information that's really important to receive with the realistic feasibility of what can be provided given the changing in accounting systems and the change in leadership without necessarily that historical knowledge. Any questions or comments from the committee or from others?
It's a little overwhelming, but looks good.
I know, I'm sorry. I'll send it over, or I'll have Betsy send it out later on so it can be on the website too.
And if we get down the line and there's something I'm just not going to be able, just don't have the time and capacity to do, then I'll just let you know, but we'll certainly, most of this seems fairly reasonable, but none of the backside is built for it. So, but it's pretty, this is pretty, the kind of the base structure you would typically see in a school system. It meets, the basic elements of the standards for budgeting in schools. So I think it's a great, it's a great framework to use.
Natalia?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is this different from last year? I mean, this looks great. It's very logical. It makes sense. Do you want to
The
highlight
differences
any
are
big
the four
changes?
differences I mentioned, the
Oh,
executive
okay, just
summary, the
those.
special
Okay.
revenue, yep, the shifting of stuff towards the schools, and then I forget what the fourth one. Oh, and then the different, the years that we'll be focusing on, just clarifying that.
Yeah. No, this looks great.
Great. Okay, so we have a plan. Anything else? I think we're on old and new business here. Let me turn off sharing. Old and new business. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
I have some old and new business.
Okay.
One of the things that at the last meeting I was asked was why is the food services zero waste showing separate from the food service revolving fund?
Thank you. Yeah.
So I wanted to follow up. So I did some research on that. And it's actually a multi-year grant provided from Fidelity. And so through the paperwork I looked at, the comptroller and the conversations, it was set up as a private grant. And so really what we need to do is take it out of the section that says revolving and put it up under the private grant. Okay.
Yes.
So I'll do that for the next time.
Yay.
Thank
you for
another
looking
question
that
that was asked was around BEEP and how is the revenue collected? Because what we were looking at is like, when is, what does the posting of the cash receipts in the treasurer's office impact or influence, how our final numbers for FY 23 are going to look? And the answer to that is yes. So BEEP, there's three methods of payment. You can pay an annual amount, you can pay biannually, or you can pay monthly, or no, quarterly, or you can pay monthly. So yeah, there would be receipts that would be coming in June for those paying on a monthly basis that wouldn't have been posted. So hopefully that answers the question about.
But where did the
timing.
FY24 revenue come from? Were those people who paid FY24 like last May? They paid their entire annual tuition? Because it was showing FY24 revenue posted of $1 million, and that's what we couldn't figure out. There was other revenue too, but in particular, BEEP revenue was very high.
Okay, I didn't ask that question, so I'll look into that.
Okay. I mean, I don't think it's the end of the world. It was just curious.
Yeah. Do the people that are paying on an annual basis pay the money? Then the other question is, I also noticed that in order to kind of like reserve your slot, you pay a $600 deposit. So it could be a combination of the two, but let me ask that specific question and then it'll be old business on the next agenda. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay, I have one new business.
Yes.
So hot off the presses, the NESDEC enrollment projection came in. And I have not had time to read through it, but I did peek. So I want to make you aware of that, and we'll certainly send it out to the Finance Committee tomorrow. But one of the things I wanted to see is, what are they thinking from this report using this methodology, what they believe our enrollment's going to be looking like. And so what it's showing, at least from their analysis, is that next year the difference will be about 11 students, so a very small shift in overall enrollment. Now that'll impact elementary slightly different than the high school. When I'm looking at the elementaries, at the high school, you're going to gain maybe, a dozen students, and then across the elementary schools, you're going to have a shift of losing some. So there's a kind of a net effect, but it's basically a net of minus 11 for next year's using their methodology. So I thought that was important because I was wondering where are we headed? And then it's showing kind of the years after that, you know, again, a slight decline. So this will be interesting to look at the next big report that we get on enrollment and see using those methodologies, you know, how are they forecasting? So I'll send that out so you can start to read it. The data team we really haven't had any time to take a look at this, but I just wanted you to know, hot off the presses, this piece of data has come in, and I'll share that with you.
So one of the things I saw that you had forwarded the NASDAQ report to me, which I haven't looked at either. And one of the things that I was curious about in response to your point about multiple enrollment forecasts, and I haven't looked at their methodology, but they did discuss birth, prior year birth, or like 5-year prior births to forecast kindergarten, which in Brookline, because of the churn in the population, has been determined to be like completely irrelevant because we have, so it'll be really interesting to see. I wasn't sure if they actually were relying on the birth data or just presenting the birth data, but that would be something to look at. But to your point, I think it's really important that everyone in the community starts to understand that any one forecast is not like the be all and end all, that each forecast has its own methodology, its own algorithm behind it. And that what we really need to do is to understand these different methodologies and, you know, triangulate among them, because there's going to be no forecast which is always accurate. So we need to have a sort of a sense of where we're going on that.
And one of the things they do is they break it out into kind of like cohorts. That's one of the things I do like. So it'll show you like kindergarten, you know, it'll show you in bands. So you can kind of get a sense of what might be happening like with the middle school age group and at the high school. And so maybe it'll start to pick up some of the trends of students that are going to private schools at different, or returning from private schools at different points. Yeah.
And
then,
as we said last time, you also have Cropper McKibben doing another forecast.
That's right.
Which will be delivered in January or February or somewhere in that time zone.
By mid February. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have theirs. Yeah.
Cliff, you get the last word.
Sorry. I look forward to seeing this, but do they do their analysis on a school by school basis?
No.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Really
Have a good
appreciate
night.
it. Okay. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.